Hi there, and welcome to the Ruby 1.9 walkthrough. I'm Peter Cooper. This is basically going to be a walkthrough, or you might want to call it a review, of how Ruby 1.9.2 and 1.9.3 compare to 1.8.7, which is probably the most popularly deployed version of Ruby out there at the moment. So I've seen a lot of people are a little bit hesitant about moving up to 1.9. Hopefully this video will kind of set the sort of score straight on that front. So I have actually gone through over the last few weeks, especially, I mean, I've been on 1.9 for a long time, but I've been doing special research for this video, going through hundreds of different things, hundreds of code examples, just to see what's changed. And I've boiled that all down into this video, so hopefully you'll find it really useful. Now, I like, there's an old quote from Matt's where he says that Ruby is simple in appearance, but is very complex inside, just like the human body. And even though he didn't mean it in this context, I think it also applies to the 1.8 to 1.9 transition. It looks easy on the surface, you know, the syntax and things like that are mostly the same, but under the surface, it's more difficult than you think. You know, it's not just adding things like the character encodings, there's, you know, lots of little minor syntax changes and minor changes to classes that you're probably already using, or things in the standard library that you would expect to be there but no longer there, things like that. So that's what this video really digs into. Once you watch this video, even if you haven't followed everything I've said, of course you can rewind and do all that kind of thing, but at least some of it should have sunk in. You know, you should get a feel for what there is available and how you can progress with your upgrading to 1.9. And part of the reason for making this is that many of the videos and blog posts that I've seen around the web that are, I'll put quotes, new in Ruby 1.9 are quite often out of date or wrong, and that's not, you know, any malice or any problem, you know, of the person that created the article. It's just that time has gone by and things have actually been reverted. They were put into 1.9.0 but then removed again from the 1.9 branch, so certain changes didn't actually occur, and some things even got backported to Ruby 1.8. So if you wrote an article when 1.8.6 was out saying what's new in 1.9, well, when enumerators, for example, got ported back to 1.8.7, we can't really consider that to be new in 1.9 anymore as such. You know, you're probably already using those, so you don't want to know, you know, too much detail about how to use them. So anyway, you've seen enough of my face for now. Just wanted to sort of say hi. You know, I'm not going to be on the rest of the video. I shall talk to you no longer. Now, just in case anyone's watching this video and they didn't buy it through me, perhaps, just to quickly explain who I am, I'm Peter Cooper. I run the Ruby Inside blog. I run Ruby Flow, Ruby Weekly, which is a weekly email newsletter about Ruby, and lots of different Ruby things. I've been using Ruby since about 2004 in various forms. And yeah, here's some URLs that you can access to learn a little bit more about me. So I just want to quickly stress that this is definitely a walkthrough. It's not a tutorial. You know, I would expect you to know Ruby. This is definitely not a Ruby tutorial, and I'm going to be covering new features, removed features, changes that you need to be aware of in 1.9 as opposed to 1.8. But to fully learn how to use every single part of this, you're going to need to rely on other tutorials and references. So books like the Pickaxe, the Ruby programming language by O'Reilly, things like that. I'm not going to dig into every single detail. This is really a walkthrough so you can get to grips with what the main differences are. But nonetheless, I'll try and show you the basics on as much as I can. Now, there is a lot in here. This video is very extensive, so there may be details that I'll get wrong along the way, but I'll be maintaining errata so that I'll be able to send that to you. Your name will be on a list, so I'll be able to send you updates, and once it reaches a certain time, or perhaps a certain amount of errata possibly, then what I'll do is I'll reshoot parts of the video and then send an update through that process I just mentioned. So Ruby 1.9 has had an interesting history. It first became the de facto official production version of Ruby in January 2009, January the 30th to be precise, and at the time of recording that's almost 3 years ago, so 3 years the core teams pretty much said, right, 1.9, this is the new thing, and as you can see here in this blog post, it says Ruby 1.9 is a new series of Ruby, it's modern, faster, so on and so forth, and they're just kind of explaining that, you know, they consider this to be the first stable release of the 1.9 series. Now, you might wonder why 1.9.1, why not 1.9.0? Well, originally 1.9 was a development-only version in the Unix, sort of the Linux numbering tradition. So where, like with the Linux kernel, you know, you have the odd numbers, for example, and the even numbers, and the differences between the development and the production versions. Well, the same was going on with Ruby, so 1.9 was going to be a development version, sort of heading towards a Ruby 2.0, but it changed, things changed along the way, and they deemed 1.9.1 onwards would be considered a production release. So, the history of 1.9 specifically, one of the biggest changes in 1.9 versus 1.8 is the YARV, or YARV. This stands for Yet Another Ruby VM. It's a virtual machine that was built in great part by this guy, Koichi Sasada, a member of the Ruby core team in Japan. And this made a massive, massive difference because it's much quicker than the old interpreted style that 1.8 was using. Now, we need to touch on MRI just a little bit here because once upon a time, 1.9 was sometimes referred to as KRI for Koichi's Ruby interpreter, but what's kind of happened now is that MRI is generally accepted to be any of the de facto official Ruby implementations, whether that's 1.8 or 1.9. That is a slight shift in the terminology, but when someone says MRI now, they're not just referring to 1.8, they could actually be referring to the 1.9 that we're going to be discussing today as well. And I had a quick look back through the archives. 2003. That was the oldest build of 1.9 I could find. And that just blew me away. I mean, I wasn't expecting that at all when I was doing the research for this. And the reason that's significant is not just because that's a really, really long time ago, but because Ruby 1.8.0 was only released on August 4th, 2003. So, pretty serious. But things didn't get serious on the 1.9 front from a regular developer's point of view until November the 4th, 2006. And Koichi, at that point, he posted to the Ruby core mailing list about the plan of merging YARV that he'd built into Ruby, like Ruby proper, what we now know as MRI. And that was essentially the birth of Ruby 1.9 as something that, you know, pretty much anyone could check out, anyone can get involved in. That was when it started to become useful at that point. And Ruby 1.9.0 came out of that whole process, and that was released on Christmas Day 2007, carrying on that tradition of Christmas Day releases for versions of Ruby. But then 1.9.1, as I said, first production version of 1.9, that was released on January the 30th, 2009. And as I said, first 1.9 considered production after the change of the versioning policy, but it was quite crash happy. And I've had sort of like minor debates with people about this, saying, oh yeah, 1.9.1 was the first stable release. And they're like, no, it wasn't. It wasn't stable at all. And I must admit, I did have some problems myself with segmentation faults, very common. A lot of libraries didn't work on it. And that is why Brightbox, a British-based Rails hosting company, they put together this site called isitruby19. You can still get access to this. It's at isitruby19.com. And it came out around that sort of 2009 period to allow people to see which gems, which libraries worked on 1.9 and which didn't. So you could go in and you can actually report, and you can see here the green is success and the red is fail. This site isn't that relevant anymore, from my opinion, because pretty much everything useful that I've found does tend to work on 1.9 now, so that's pretty cool. But then the big, big release was Ruby 1.9.2. This is where Ruby 1.9 really came of age and became something that was truly stable, not just the core team saying it's stable, it actually worked very well, and you know, it was a good excuse at that point to actually move on to 1.9. And I've been on Ruby 1.9 pretty much full time. Well, actually, full time since 1.9.1, but it was 1.9.2 which made me really happy about deploying it in production a lot. And yeah, finally stable. But importantly, it actually passed 99% of the Ruby spec. And Ruby spec was an effort that several different people from different implementations were involved, particularly from the Rubinius implementation. Were involved in putting together, and still are putting together, a set of specs that are written in our spec that define how Ruby works under the hood. So if you pass in a certain value to a certain method, what should come out of that? And then it's a specification that different implementations can meet. And 1.9.2 passed it to a 99% level, which is very, very good. So don't worry about that. But a lot of the stuff that I'm covering in this video was new to 1.9.2, so if you are on 1.9.0 or 1.9.1, I wouldn't have no idea why you would still be on those versions. Just bear in mind, this video is from the 1.9.2 perspective. Now, 1.9.3 is on the way, Preview 1 was released on August the 1st of 2011. It's not a significant leap compared to how 1.9.2 was. That was a pretty big leap. 1.9.3 adds a variety of features, and we'll be covering those at the end of the video. There's going to be a whole section about doing 1.9.3 changes and so on and so forth. But don't worry about it too much. Not a massive leap, but some cool stuff nonetheless. Now, what other implementations are there? Well, we've already looked at MRI, the whole YARL thing, but there are other implementations of Ruby that support 1.9, just in case you're interested in porting things or moving across to different implementations, wondering whether what you learn in this video is going to be useful anywhere else. Well, it will. Mac Ruby, which runs on OS X only at the moment, but I think there may be plans to run it on Linux in the future. Mac Ruby has always been 1.9 focused, so no worries there. JRuby added a 1.9.2 compatible mode as of 1.6, so I think that wasn't too long ago, but that's coming along really well. Rubinius 2 hasn't been finally released as of this recording, but does have a 1.9 mode in it. I know they've had a few sticking problems with it and so on, but that should be coming quite mature very soon, and hopefully will be by the time you get around to this video. And last but not least, we have Iron Ruby. And I'm really focusing on the significant implementations here, so not anything too experimental, but Iron Ruby 1.1.1 shifted entirely to 1.9, so it's not like it even added 1.9 as a mode. They were shifting to it completely. But for the rest of this video, we're going to focus on MRI primarily. You might take a lot of what you learn here across into these other implementations, but we're focusing on MRI. So what is our journey? Well, we need to split our journey up into kind of two lists here, because there's quite a lot of things I'm going to cover. I don't want to go through the whole list. You're going to see these things as we go along. But just bear in mind, we are going to first just quickly look at how to get Ruby 1.9, and then we're going to jump through different sections of Ruby, so strings, character encodings, hashes, arrays, so on and so forth. Then we'll move on to the second section, which, again, more elements like regular expressions and files, importantly, threads and fibers, some key changes there. We're going to look at the standard library. Some things have been added, some things have been taken away. Then, the big daddy of this whole thing is the new syntax and miscellaneous elements section. Lots and lots of useful, interesting stuff there, but it's stuff that couldn't be grouped into these other areas. It's like a minor piece of syntax has been added, or just little tidbits, little tips. I could really go through those nice and quickly with you. Have a quick look at some extra garbage collection stuff that's been done. Nothing significant in there. But then we'll look at the 1.9.3 specifics to bring everything to an end. Let's run through some of the key changes in Ruby 1.9.2 and 3 as compared to 1.8.7. Already mentioned that there is a new virtual machine. In fact, there is a virtual machine, as opposed to it just being interpreted. The fine work of Koichi Sasada, mostly, who we've already talked about, and it is fast. It's definitely faster by quite a bit in some cases, not so much in others. There have been benchmarks, lots of different benchmarks have been done over the years. Some that stood out particularly were by Antonio Cangiano. He did some sort of earlier on, a few years ago, and he showed an average of 4 times speed improvement over the original interpreter on a variety of different tests. But it varies a lot. In the real world, air quotes, certain types of app, like Rails apps, for example, can sometimes not seem much faster for a crazy number of reasons. We'll look at a couple of those, but things like the speed of loading all of the gems up and stuff like that. It varies. It does vary quite a bit. But one of the cool things about the Ruby 1.9 is that instead of just an abstract syntax tree being created and interpreted, which is what happened in 1.8, we actually compile the abstract syntax tree down to opcodes for a virtual machine, which is the YARV, the YARV thing that we've been talking about. And that's much more efficient and requires less traversal of the syntax tree. There's also some other stuff that they baked into 1.9, which I'm afraid I don't fully understand, but there is symbol table compaction and object compaction, but unfortunately I don't know much about this, and it seems to be hard to dig up information, so just take that for granted. Rubygems is now built into Ruby, so it used to be something you would install separately. You'd have to run ruby setup.rb and it would install and all that type of thing. Well, now it is built in. But if you want to get the latest Rubygems, which it's moving on at quite a clip, fair clip. There's a lot going on with Rubygems. You can still do your gem update -- system if you want. And 1.9.2 came with Rubygems 1.3.7. 1.9.3, as of the time of recording, comes with 1.8.6, and I know they're already well on beyond that now, even already. So things are moving quick in the Rubygems world, but it is in there. You don't need to require Rubygems now at the start of every single script. You can still do it if you want to maintain 1.8 compatibility, but it's not a necessity anymore. Although I do know you could use it, you could put it in your RubyOpt environment string and not do it, but now you don't need it at all anywhere. Another biggie is that the load path no longer includes the working directory as of 1.9.2. What does that mean? Well, it means if you have a script that's in a directory called a.rb and you want to load b.rb, you used to be able to do require, in quotes, b. That would work fine. Well, now you're going to need to either add the current directory to the load path, which you can push on if you like. You could use require underscore relative. That's a new method in Ruby 1.9. Or you could use require, but then actually address the local path specifically using // and this was implemented as a security measure. There is a new hash syntax, so you no longer need the hash rocket, which is the equals than, the greater than sign. As you can see here with this little demo on the screen, this is a hash, and you might think, well, what does name, what do age, what do gender represent? They are symbols. They don't start with a colon, but in this new hash syntax, all of the keys are assumed to be symbols. So you need to keep that in mind. If you want to still do a hash that perhaps doesn't use symbols as the keys, you'll still want to do it the old way, as it were. There is now support for character encoding, so it's no longer ASCII or binary or bust, essentially. There was some bare bones support for some Japanese encodings and UTF-8 in Ruby 1.8, but now things have got pretty serious, things have got pretty real, and we're going to go and dig into some of this stuff later. Threads also got real. We now have system-level threads in MRI, with a catch. So there is still a global interpreter lock, also known as the GIL, so that only one thread is truly running at a time. But there are still some improvements in terms of being able to deal with I/O and things like that. Certain types of system I/O don't block anymore, and things like that. So it's still a good thing that we have got these system-level threads as opposed to just the green threads. But if you like green threads, you can kind of emulate them using the new Fibers system. And Fibers are essentially a lightweight coroutine system. And what that means is you can have like a method. It's kind of like a method that you can re-enter. So you can run some code, you can have it yield back to somewhere else, and then you can re-enter it with all of its state still intact. You can think of this a little bit like manually scheduled threads. But again, we're going to do a whole section on these, so we'll get to these soon. And last but not least, in these key changes, continuations are now dead. Hurrah! If you didn't use them, you don't really want to know too much about them, but they are gone. Sort of. You can, in 1.9.2, sadly do require continuation and get them back. But you don't want to do that. Don't do it. Let's quickly mention getting Ruby 1.9. How do you get hold of Ruby 1.9? Well, perhaps the best way is to compile from source. This is the most pure way of doing it. Go to the ruby-lang.org, download a tarball, install it from there. Not too difficult, but you don't perhaps got quite as much control as you'd like. But it's good if you're on a Unix-style operating system, Linux, OS X, whatever. But there are different ways of getting about it. I just want to mention OS X actually, specifically, because it does come with Ruby. It comes with MRI Ruby, but it's still 1.8.7, even in Lion. So, what could we do? We can do this on Linux, OS X, any kind of POSIX-compatible operating system. We can use RVM. And RVM is the Ruby version manager. It's developed by Wayne Seguin. And what it allows you to do, essentially, is you can install lots of different types of Ruby. It'll install JRuby for you. I think it'll install MacRuby for you. You can install all various different versions of MRI, 1.8, 1.9, so on and so forth. It's great. You can get hold of that at beginrescuen.com or just Google for RVM. It tends to come up first. Really good system. Does require you to have compilation tools and things like that on your system, but you really need them anyway. So that's how I like to install 1.9. But there is another alternative. If you want to do things the raw, sort of natural way of doing things, I guess. But without compiling by hand, you can use Ruby build. And get hold of this, just Google Ruby-build. It should come up first. If not, put GitHub on the end. I didn't want to put the URL in here because I believe that an official site for Ruby build is going to be put up not too long in the future. It may even be up by now, so it's better to Google for this stuff than for me to give you a URL that could be wrong. But essentially, Ruby build gives you a tool and a set of recipes to build various Ruby implementations from source, and that includes 1.9. If you're on Windows, there are options for you. You can go to rubyinstaller.org, and on there they have downloads. It's basically like a big installer file that you can download. It has Ruby 1.9.2. Hopefully they'll release a 1.9.3. That may be out by the time that you listen to this recording, hopefully. But if not, get hold of 1.9.2. It's on there. Or you can lean on Engine Yard's project Rails Installer. That's at railsinstaller.org, and that also includes things like Rails, Free, and Git. So that could be useful for you. But now let's actually get to some code. So we're going to look at strings first, and there are a few different topics relating to strings, which includes character encoding. We're just going to look at strings on their own right now. So what I'm going to actually do at this point is I'm going to take you over to a special prompt that I've created, especially for this project. I've called it IRB free. That's because it gave me access to 3 different variants of Ruby from one. But it's slightly different now. I've made a few tweaks, but either way, you can see how it works. I'll put in something like 2 + 2, and I get the result coming from 1.8.7 and 1.9.2. And because I should show you how this tool works, just show it off a little bit more, if I put a comment on the end that says all, I'll get access to 1.8 and 1.9.3 as well. And I'll be using this throughout the rest of this video to show you things that have changed and how they vary between different versions. So, strings. Well, a very important thing about strings in Ruby 1.9 is that they are now character-based rather than just byte-based. So if you've got a string that contains A, B, C, well, if you access each character in that, that's fine, because it's usually ASCII encoded or UTF-8 encoded, and each byte within that string relates to a character within the string. But because of the character encoding stuff that's been added to support various different character encodings and stuff that perhaps has multiple bytes representing each character, you can no longer say byte 1 relates to character 1 and byte 2 relates to character 2. There may be a different mapping between bytes and characters. So now in Ruby 1.9, we're dealing with characters primarily, other than bytes. And we also no longer have the each method. Now, this did actually change in 1.8.7, but it's important to just bring this up because some people are still using each in relation to strings. So if I create a string just very quickly with new lines in it, so imagine this is spread over many lines, and then I do each, and I create something like this. I just print out each line within my string. You'll see that on 1.8.7, each works. We don't really want that, that's not going to be happening in 1.9.2. You can't do that. As it shows you here, undefined method each. You can't do that with 1.9.2. Well, what can you do instead? Well, you can use the each_line method or lines. And this will actually work in 1.8.7, but let me just show you why this is important to bear in mind. So if I do each line, as you can see, that will work across the board. But then if we go to using lines, and we'll use .each with that, it wasn't present in 1.8.6, so you need to bear this in mind. Now, let's go on to that character stuff. See the difference? If we access characters, and remember we're talking characters now, not bytes, we get back the character that we're trying to access rather than the ASCII value. So as you can see, I'm not accessing the first byte anymore that is the letter A in terms of its internal value, which comes back as 97 because that's the ASCII for lowercase a. We actually get back the character in 1.9.2. This can be a key difference. If you're doing a check for a character at the start of the string and you're doing it by an ASCII code or something, that's not going to work in the same way in Ruby 1.9. And You also have the query and then you put a character after. That has changed as well. What happens? As before, we have the ASCII value come back in 1.8, but in 1.9.2, just the character comes back. So this sort of notation isn't very useful in 1.9 anymore. But we do have something in Ruby 1.9 if you want to get access to the code for a character. So if we take our character like our X, you can use the ORD, which I believe stands for ordinal. That will bring back, and as you can see, 1.8.7, it doesn't work at all. So unfortunately, this wasn't backported. I wish it kind of was, because this is something that you may need to do commonly, and it'd be nice if 1.8 supported the same technique, but it does not. But what we get from ORD will actually work on any string, but it will take the first character and then return the value for that character. So in this case, we're just dealing with normal ASCII, or UTF-8 in truth, but X will come back with its normal ASCII value of 120 in this case. But I have some special strings brewed into this special IRB, kind of IRB-alike that I've developed here. So I have a string called string free. Now let's have a quick look at what that is. You will see a difference here. String free actually contains a Japanese character, along with some normal ASCII characters, and then an extended character, which this isn't ASCII, so this is actually UTF-8. So I'm not entirely sure how this is encoded, but you may know this as an extended ASCII character in certain encodings. And how is this depicted in 1.8.7? Well, because it can't tell, it doesn't care about the encoding, it doesn't care about UTF-8. It's actually just showing us the byte values that make up this character. So this one Japanese character is represented by 3 different bytes, and then the E with the accent is reflected by 2 different bytes. But nonetheless, what we can do here is we can still go .ord, and that will give us the value of the first character. Of course, it's not going to work for this, not going to work for 1.8, but for 1.9.2 it gives us 12.454, and that's because that's where it is in the Unicode system, because we're currently running under UTF-8. Now, there is another way of getting access to all this stuff in Ruby 1.9. You can use the code points method. And what code points will do is it will return an enumerator. Now, hopefully you've used enumerators in 1.8. I'm not going to go too deeply into them in this video. But what this will do is it allow us to go next, next, next on the result and get each code point, which is each character essentially, but it will give you the value of the code point of that character within its encoding system, rather than the actual character itself. But what we can do with this is we could say code points.first, we take the first one, and we get the same as we did with .ord. As in Ruby 1.8.7, we can use bytes to get access to a byte-by-byte enumerator. But we get something else that's called in Ruby 1.9. We get getByte and setByte, which allows us to work directly on the bytes. So just for example, we take the second byte. Now remember that the first 3 bytes in the case of our string, if I bring this up and I convert bytes to an array, see this works the same in 1.8 and 1.9, but that Japanese character is represented by 3 bytes here, 227, 130, 166. Well, what if we want to mess around with our string and we want to set the third byte, so remember it's 0 indexed, and we'll set that to 167 instead of 166. What will the result be? You can see now that the Japanese symbol has changed from one type of Japanese symbol to another, and I'm too ignorant of Japanese to tell you what's happened there. But essentially we've moved up 1 code point in the Unicode scheme, and so we end up with a different character. Now another thing that you can do with strings in 1.9 that you can't do in 1.8 is just totally clear them out, because strings are mutable in Ruby. So if we take something like A is hello, you can call a.clear, and what will A equals at that point? This is an in-place complete clearing of the string back to an empty string. One other thing I just want to pick up on is that the unpack method, which you would often use with strings to convert a string, perhaps it might even be a binary representation of something but stored in a string, you want to unpack that back into a different form of data. You'd use the unpack method. Well, what that will do now is it will also support a block So if you put a block on the end of an unpack, it will run that block once for each match that it makes with the formatting string. So just to give you a demonstration of what's involved with that, you may not use unpack, but if you do, you could find this useful. If we took something like that, for example, you can see we get the same result in 187 and 192. But if we put a block on the end, and we actually print out the value each run through the block, you'll see that nothing happens on 187. We still just get back this. The block is totally ignored. Whereas on 192, nil now comes back, but the block is run once for each match of the signed 8-bit value, which is what C stands for. Star stands for as many as you can grab, essentially, is a wild card. And it gives us back each element coming through the block. Character encoding is one of the really big deals in 1.9. Back in the good old days of 1.8, everything's pretty much treated as ASCII or raw binary data at the end of the day. Problem is, we often want to access stuff that isn't in ASCII's limited character set, or perhaps we want to manipulate characters and we don't want to rely on having to do like transitions and things like that ourselves. Well, thankfully, the Unicode Standard exists. Hopefully, we've all used it, as well as the UTF-8 character encoding standard, which is one way of representing Unicode characters. Well, the great thing is Ruby 1.9 now has direct support for using any of many different character encoding systems. So not just UTF-8, UTF-16, UTF-32, Shift-JIS. There's tons of systems out there. I think there's at least like 50 included with Ruby 1.9. And in fact, we can actually count them in a minute when we get to some code. So let's pop back to the prompt again. Now, as I said, I have some multiple strings here. I have a string 2 and I have a string 3, which they both basically contain characters that are in UTF-8. And if we have a look at the length, this will show off some of what's going on. So take string 2. You can see here that it's 2 characters long, yet it's 4 bytes long. Well, if we do length, we get a different result in 1.8 and 1.9. 1.8 gives us the 4, which is the number of bytes, and 192 gives us the number of characters. So when I said earlier that strings are now based on characters rather than bytes, I wasn't lying. So this is all very useful. It means that Ruby 1.9 is essentially character encoding aware. So that's useful to know. We go through our string with the Japanese symbol in. As I showed you before, you can address individual characters, and we are no longer getting bytes out here, we are getting characters in 1.9, whereas 1.8 is still sticking to the bytes. So if you have a Ruby 1.8 script and you're doing this type of addressing in your code, this is something you are definitely going to need to port. Now, you may already be familiar in Ruby 1.8 with the K-code variable, which you can set as a variable. You can also set it from the command line. And one of the things you can do is set it to U, and then what that will do is that even in 1.8, it will give you the same sort of answer that you would get to 1.9, but it's quite limited. It only applies to certain things, and Ruby 1.8 isn't truly, it's kind of almost like a cheap hack that's been added on, and K-code is gone. Well, not quite gone. It's no longer effective. K-code is no longer effective, ignored. So this is having absolutely no effect in 1.9 whatsoever. And yeah, it wasn't the best way of doing it. It only supported like 3 different encodings, and it was a bit of a kludge at the end of the day. Well, what else do we have available to us? Well, I've already shown you the thing with the length, so we have the difference in lengths between these, but we do have byte size, which will get us access to the exact number of bytes. That's the same in 1.8 and in 1.9 in this case. And we can also ask a string what encoding it's in. Now, this doesn't exist in 1.8, of course, but in 1.9.2, it tells us this is in UTF-8, and because it brings back an encoding object, that encoding object supports various different methods, but one of them's name. It gets you out the nice name. And because Ruby 1.9 is Unicode aware, you can't trick it. You can't put in horrible things that make no sense in UTF-8, for example, when using the U flag on a regular expression. So take something that's not UTF-8, but isn't regular ASCII either, and we put that into a regular expression. It works in 1.8, it doesn't work in 1.9, it is an invalid multi-byte escape in terms of UTF-8, so Ruby is always keeping and paying attention to that type of thing. Now, one thing you can do with strings in 1.9 is if you know they're in a certain encoding, but perhaps Ruby hasn't recognised that encoding, something along those lines. You can take some code like hello. So if I do hello and I do .encoding, it will tell us it's in UTF-8. But what I could do is I could go false encoding to US ASCII. And you see it comes out the same because US ASCII at these lower code points is the same as UTF-8 essentially. But, sorry, I need to use encoding there. And this will tell us that it's now in US ASCII. But it hasn't actually re-encoded the string. It's just changed internally in Ruby 1.9's internal representation of the string. It just says, okay, I now see this as US ASCII, but it hasn't actually done any conversion. So if there are any characters in there that perhaps aren't valid in US ASCII, we would end up with big problems. Now, if you do want to re-encode, then you can use the Encode Funk method. So I take string 2, so this gives us a cedilla and then an E with an acute accent. This is in UTF-8, which we can double check. We can encode this to the ISO 88591 encoding. This is the Western European Latin encoding, which does have both of those symbols in it. And what we can do is we can encode that string. And because we are currently on a UTF-8 terminal, it will print out the what the actual bytes are worth in ISO 88591. But that is valid. If we were on a terminal that supported ISO 88591, that would print correctly. And you can see the values there as well. And the cool thing with this is, of course, you get a string back from encode, so I could just encode it straight back to UTF-8 again. And you see that it makes the transition going to one encoding and then back again. But there are going to be times where we have something that's not going to work. So we'll take string 3, because string 3 has this Japanese symbol in, and that Japanese symbol is not present in ISO 88591. So I'll copy this, string 3, put this on the end. And we have an error. An exception is raised because it can't convert that Japanese symbol into the Western European encoding that we wanted to do. Luckily, Encode gives us a way around this. What we can do, and I'm going to create a string for this, is there are some some extra flags that we can put in here. We can say that if a character is undefined, and notice we're using the new hash syntax here for Ruby 1.9, if something is undefined, replace it with something, and we'll replace it with something along those lines. And then what we'll do is, just to make sure that we can view it once it's done the transition, we'll translate it back to UTF-8 again. So we'll add in an extra section here, which will take our string, and it will encode it back to UTF-8, so hopefully we can see what happened. Now 1.8 completely bust, of course, whereas 1.9.2, what it's done is it's put where the Japanese symbol was, so we had the Japanese symbol there, ABC, but E with an acute accent is available in this encoding, so this made the translation, and then all of it's come back to UTF-8 using this encode at the end. Another thing we can do is we can take our string 3, and we can try and encode it to our Western European encoding again, but we can pass in this. What this will do on Ruby 1.9 is it will convert the invalid character that it can't represent somehow in the text to an XML entity. Another thing we can do is we can also check whether a string is invalid encoding. Now, string 3 is perfectly fine at the moment, that's cool. But what we could do is we could try and set the first byte to something like 200. This won't fit in with UTF-8 at all, it's not going to be happy with this, because UTF-8 has to be put in a certain way. So we'll set the first byte to 200, do string 3, valid encoding, and for that we get false. Another thing that's also possible to do is possible to check whether a specific encoding, so we'll take our string 3 encoding, which is UTF-8, remember, we can check whether it's ASCII compatible. Essentially this means that the first 128 lower byte values, essentially, between 0 and 128 in the ASCII table, that they will come up correct. And I mean 0 to 127, but you know what I mean. But in certain encodings, that won't be true. You won't be able to use, they won't have any ASCII compatibility in that respect. So if I take a string like blah, for example, and I encode it into little endian UTF-32, I take the encoding from that. Is that ASCII compatible? It's not. Now something else we can do is we can actually ask Ruby what encodings does it support. And this takes up the whole screen. You can see there's quite a lot. And remember earlier I said I wasn't entirely sure exactly how many encodings there were, perhaps about 50. It looks a bit more than that, but we can find out with encoding.list.length. There's 95. I'm just blown away. I just didn't imagine there would be so many. But Ruby doesn't just refer to them under the names that are available. In fact, we can try this. We will... And this type of syntax for passing in, doing the symbol to proc trick is a 1.8.7ism. But again, it works in 1.9. Here are all the different names for them, but some of them are aliases. And what you can do here is you can do encoding.aliases is a class method that will give you access to a hash that allows you to relate an alias into the internal name of the actual encoding, because there are various different names that mean the same thing as one another. So for example, CP1251 goes to Windows 1251. Binary goes to ASCII 8-bit. They basically mean exactly the same thing. Now earlier when we were looking at strings, we looked at things like doing .lines, there was .bytes, .code point. Well, there are special iterators available to you now to do things like that. You can do each byte, you can do each char, you can do each code point. So that gives you access to all those different ways to walk through a string essentially. And something else you can do is perhaps you want to write code that works on both 1.8 and 1.9 to a certain extent. You can do checks upon the string class to see whether you've got the support for the character encoding or not. So in this case, we could do something like method defined encode, and I'll make this run on all the different Rubies. So you can see on the 1.8s it doesn't exist, on the 1.9s it does. So you might use that in a class definition, do an if, and then put the definitions of things inside those if and else blocks and change the way the code works slightly depending on whether character encoding support is available or not. Let's quickly switch to the text editor. It's important to note in Ruby 1.9 that there are 3 different types of encoding that you need to keep in mind. There is the source encoding, there's the external encoding, and there's the internal encoding. What do all these things mean? Well, first is the source encoding, and you can get access to whatever the source encoding is by using __encoding___. This gives you access to that, and you can also get access to the default external and the default internal encodings using this code here. Well, if we run them, what happens? Well, it's telling us that the source encoding is UTF-8, the default external is UTF-8, and the last is nil. But what does all this mean? Well, the source encoding is the encoding that the actual source code file is in, and this can vary on a file-by-file basis. By default, files are treated as if they're in US ASCII, but if you put in a definition like this at the top, this can come after a shebang line, but otherwise has to be the first thing. You need something that at the minimum says coding, : and then the name of the encoding of the actual Ruby file. And what this means, and I prefer to use encoding, you do see this more commonly, what this means is that string literals and the actual Ruby code itself are treated as being in UTF-8. And because my text editor is in UTF-8 mode, that's perfect for me. And what that actually allows me to do is it allows me to double check and say abcd.encoding.name, that is in UTF-8. And that's because the source encoding is set to UTF-8. So anything string literals or source code in this file is UTF-8. But it goes a little bit further than that. Because we're in the UTF-8 as the source encoding, I can actually use UTF-8 characters as identifiers in the language. So I could have a method called E with an acute accent on it, for example. And then I could call that. And it will work. And this leads you to all sorts of wacky experiments. People have created things using mathematical symbols, lambda symbols, pi, anything that you can type or copy and paste from somewhere else that's in UTF-8, you can put in there and you can try and use it as a method name or a variable name or anything like that. It will work. Gets a bit crazy though. I wouldn't recommend you go too far down that line. And yeah, as I said before, that source encoding can vary per file. These other ones, however, these are pretty much global to the process that's running at the moment. And the external encoding is how Ruby deals with things that have come from the outside world. So, for example, if we're reading a file and we don't specify anything special, it will treat that file as coming in as being in UTF-8 in this case, because our default external is UTF-8. And the reason it does that is because it gets the default external encoding from the environment. So the lang environment variable is set because I'm running a normal OS X setup, and it will work out from the environment that I'm in an environment where UTF-8 is the default. However, the internal, you may notice, is nil. And the reason for this is that nil also stands for let's just treat things as binary, 8-bit, kind of like how Ruby 1.8 used to. And the internal encoding is essentially if you read something in from the outside world, the external is how it will treat the incoming data. So it will look at data in the outside world in a file and say, okay, this is UTF-8, let's read it into Ruby. And if a default internal encoding is set, it will convert that information, so that UTF-8 data perhaps that's coming in from a file, it will convert it into something else. So if I set the default internal encoding to ISO 88591, for example, it would convert or transcode the UTF-8 data into ISO 88591 that I could then work with internally inside Ruby. But by default, we want to generally stick with what things are in the external coming in. But you need to be aware that it can be set. And it is also possible to set these things at the command line. I'll just give you a quick demonstration here. If you're running things from the command line, you can use the -E to set the encodings. And if you want to set the external, for example, you could do something like that and then put your file name here. If you want to set the external and the internal, so if you want to make sure that perhaps you're always reading in stuff in Western European character encodings, but then internally in your Ruby scripts you want everything to actually be transcoded to UTF-8, you could then use a colon in the middle and run your scripts like this. Now a lot of this comes to play again when you start opening files and doing stuff like that. So if I open up a file, I haven't actually got a file to open here, but let's say it's a.txt and I know it's in UTF-8. I want to kind of really make sure that Ruby knows all about this. Well, then I can write my file format string out in this way. And this will tell Ruby the external encoding in this case is UTF-8. Now, my default encoding is set to that, but this is really making the point clear. And I could do things like even read it in ASCII, binary, which means the same thing, and also another synonym, ASCII 8-bit. But what if I want to do the transcoding? I want to set both encodings. That's pretty easy too. So let's say I've got a file, it's in UTF-16 little endian, and I want to read it into UTF-8. Again, I can do that here. Saves me doing an encode. Ruby will deal with all of that for me. Now, there's two key tips to bear in mind here. I would say you should explicitly declare any encodings on the I/O objects that you're opening, just as I did there in those demonstrations. The reason for this is because if you know the encodings, it's always best to set it in stone rather than fall into problems later on and wonder why encodings don't match up with what you were expecting. And especially if you're perhaps running in a different environment on the server where the encoding may differ. If you know the input is in UTF-16 LE, for example, don't just trust the environment to know that. Actually specify it yourself. I would also recommend that where possible, and definitely in anything where you've got string literals and so on, which obviously is almost everywhere in Ruby, put the magic comment, as it's called, at the top of your source files to specify that your source file is in UTF-8. Very useful. Okay, we've spent enough time with strings now, so let's move on to hashes. There's not a massive amount new in the world of hashes, but there's some things we need to start pointing out. And the first thing, we've already mentioned it very briefly earlier on, is a new hash syntax. So, normally you can write a hash like so, and put in my age. That's not my real age, by the way. That will work everywhere. But now you get this new syntax, which allows you to write things in a slightly different way. Now you see in 1.8 it completely fails, but in 1.9.2 we get something good. And what's happening here is that these names are being treated as symbols. It's just a totally new syntax. Gives you access to just putting symbols in, but without actually putting the code on at the start. So every single thing that's in this format will be treated as a symbol, and then the values are treated in their normal way. There's one thing that doesn't work anymore in 1.9 that did work in 1.8, but you probably shouldn't have been using it anyway. Wasn't a very nice way of doing things, which was this, essentially. So if I do a similar kind of arrangement here, this is where you kind of just have a big list of things and you put it inside a hash literal. And as you can see, it worked on 1.8, doesn't work on 1.9.2, but hopefully you weren't using that anyway. Another thing is that hashes are now, they are defined as being ordered by their insertion order. So if we take our hash and we start putting things into the hash, like so, and then I have a look at the hash, you'll see that in 1.8 it's not guaranteed that the order of things in the hash is the same order as what we inserted them. So we did A, B, C here, but it came out wrong. It comes out correct in 1.9. That's good. Another thing that's changed is if you've got a hash, and we do have a default hash here in this setup, I've just called it hash, just contains some very simple information. And as you can see, the ordering again has changed here. Hash index method works, but it raises a deprecation warning. And what you used to use index for was to find the key value for a particular value. So like if I'm looking for the age and I know it's 40, this will return me the key that's associated with that value. But it tells me here, hash index is deprecated, use hash key, and that is exactly what you should do. It basically returns the key for the value. Another thing that we need to be aware of, and this is really useful actually, is if you've got a hash, you use the select method. This works pretty much like the select does for any enumeration. So we'll say take the keys and values, convert the keys into strings, and let's find any that has letter E in. So on this one we have male, there's an E in there, and in Fred there's an E, but 40 of course, no E on that. So what it should do is it should select the gender and the name and return those to us. Well, the way it did it in 1.8 is it would give you an array of arrays, as here, but in 1.9.2 it actually recognises the fact it's a hash and also returns a hash. But it does return a new hash, so if you have a look at the old hash that's coming out, it's the full deal. But in 1.9.2 specifically, they added select bang, so it actually edits the hash in place. So let's see what happens here. See, now this doesn't work in 1.8.7. This has been added, and it actually changes how the hash works. We also have access to the default proc that is associated with a hash. So this is in the case where you have a hash that you've created from new. So let's say you've done this type of thing, and previously you may have created a block on the end and then made it perhaps default so that anything that doesn't, the key value doesn't exist. So just put something like that. That will then return a hash, another hash that's within that value, and that works fine across the board. But what we have now on 1.9 is you can change this block here to something else using a proc. You can either do that on the fly, well, you can do it on the fly in any case, but you could have either had one put in place like we just did there, or you can just set it at any point you like, and what we'll do is we'll just create another proc there like that. We won't use the new syntax, we'll just stick with that for now. And then we'll say, okay, let's do our test now. Works in exactly the same way, but you can see default proc wasn't supported here. And you can actually access the default proc back out as well if you want to work with that at all, do anything with that. It's now also possible to flatten a hash. So if we take our hash, we call the flatten method upon it, doesn't work in 1.8, does work in 1.9.2, and this returns us basically an array that contains keys and values alternating throughout the array. we also have some access to some other things that you may be more used to from arrays. So from arrays, you may be used to doing something like this. You may have an array of arrays, kind of almost like a hash, but sort of represented in an array type format. And you can use assoc and rassoc. Let's just double check what those do. So what you can do is you can grab the element that has an array, where on the left hand side you have the number 3. And similarly, we can do rassoc 6, and that should pick out this element of the array. Well, now exactly the same thing works on hashes. So what you can do is, this actually isn't incredibly useful in this format. It's just basically to give you the same access to the things that are in the array way of doing things. So what we get here is hash assoc name. It returns us an array with the key and the value, where the left hand side is the association, and on the right hand side we can do exactly the same thing to get access to that information. But of course you could just use hash key now to get a similar type of effect, or hash name to access the specific element. Last but not least, while we're just focusing on hashes, there is now also a keep if method, and what this will do is it will actually amend the hash in place, and it means that you will only keep certain things in the hash if they match a certain condition. So let's start this from fresh. So we'll say hash keep if, do key value, if the key matches the letter A, so if the letter A is in the key somewhere, which I think will work for name and age but not gender. So yeah, we get name and age. And just to double check what's happening here, it's amending the hash in place. So keep if could be useful for you if you want to keep certain keys or extract certain keys that match certain requirements. You can now do that with keep if. Arrays in 1.9 are in a similar situation to the hashes. Not a significant amount of changes, but a few things we need to point out. So remember, I also have an array available for playing with here. Well, one thing that you might have used in Ruby 1.8 is the toS, or the toString method. And what it used to do was it used to just join everything together with nothing in between and return you a string. What you get now in Ruby 1.9 is pretty much the equivalent of doing the inspect call upon it instead. So this may not be what you expected, may not be what you wanted. You now need to do a join explicitly if you want to get access to that. Another little bug that was fixed, I think it was a bug anyway, is if you had something that was like array and you wanted to insert something at the start of the array, what you could do, other than using unshift for example, is you could use address the first element of the array, which is 0, and then set something of 0 width, and then put in an element. So let's put in the letter Z here and see what happens. So what it's done is it's added Z to the start of the array. That's fine, that works in both. But it wouldn't let you add nil to the start of the array. But in 1.9.2 it does. They've capped this one off and fixed this. Now, something you may be familiar with in 1.8.7 is using the choice method of array. What does that do? It returns you a single element of the array that's picked at random. So in this case we've actually got A, but as you can see it is random, it does change. Well, in 1.9.2 it becomes sample. Now, sample doesn't act in exactly the same way. Sample does actually take a parameter that will allow you to specify how many random things you should get back. So as you can see, we've got the full 2 there, we got the 3. In Ruby 1.8.7 in particular, you may also be familiar with shuffle. Just to demonstrate, shuffle hasn't gone anywhere, it works the same way in 1.9.2 and 1.9.3 as well. But if you were coming from 1.8.6 and you weren't familiar with shuffle, it's well worth knowing about. I've never really seen this in active use and I've never used it myself, but there was also another method on array called nItems. This is now gone. How did nItems work? We took an array, used nItems, and it returned the number of non-nil items within an array. So we could add in a couple of nil things here, and it's still going to return 3. But not on 1.9. That's not going to happen, it's gone. But what we could instead do is we could take the same thing and we could use the count method instead. So we'll say, please give us a count of all the elements that are not nil, Ooh, typo day, and we get exactly the same number, and it works between the different implementations, not a problem. Another new thing that I think is kind of cool is we have access to unique with a bang on the end, and product. Now, we had access to these before. They work in a very similar way now, but they can take a block that affects the way they work. So if we take something like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and we ask for the uniques, well, actually, they're all unique, not a problem. But what you can do in 1.9 is you can kind of make conditions on the uniqueness. So I could take something like, put this here, and I could say, I want them to be unique by their, their modulus to 2. So essentially what this means is that we will end up with just 1 and 2 coming through. Why is that? Well, 1, the modulus with 2 is 1, 2, the modulus with 2 is 0, but then it alternates again, 1, 0, 1, 0. Well, we've already got 1 that meets 1 and meets 0, so we just end up with those 2 elements coming through. So you could use this as a different way of sorting out the uniqueness of a list. Perhaps there are other things that you want to call upon in order to check that uniqueness. This could be very useful when you've got more complex objects in your array rather than just numbers, as in this case. So, for example, you may have an array of hashes, and you may wish to make that array, the hashes in the array, unique by a certain element in that hash. You could do that using this. And you also get exactly the same thing for the unique bang method, which will adjust the array in place. We also have a similar thing for the product. And this is not quite as advanced. We take the product. This is where it takes each element of each array and puts them into separate subarrays in a larger array of arrays, as it were. But now what you can do is you can also put another block on the end. Here we'll just print out each element as it comes along. And as you can see, what it does now is it returns the original array that we put in, but then it will go over each element of that product that it builds up along the way and iterates over that and gives us access to that there. One last little thing I just want to show you, and this was in 1.8.7, but I just want to show you it because you may not have known about it. If you've got something like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and you want to do an inject on it, and you want to do it a really simple way, there's just one method that you want to keep calling over and over on each element as it comes in. You don't want to keep track of, 2 different variables and all that type of thing. What you can do is you can pass in a symbol now that points to the method in question that you want to perform upon each thing coming in from the array, adding it to the output. So what we'll do in this case is we'll just add all the numbers together, and as you can see that works fine on both of those. But if I bring up all of them, you can see that with 1.8.6 this didn't work. So this might be a handy little trick that maybe you didn't know about. It's also possible to do the same with the symbol to proc trick, which also works in Ruby 1.8.7 and also works on the newer implementations.